you see it? Can you see the presentation?
Yes.
Okay, so good morning, everyone who are in Belgium, and good afternoon to those in the Philippines. So I am here to present the research paper I did for IOB during my advanced master's program. So my name is Jossa De Pano. I am an alumni of IOB, University of Antwerp, and my presentation is titled Gender Analysis and the Adverse Impacts of the Philippines COVID-19 Responses on Women. So to give you an outline of the paper, this is the dissertation outline, but for this presentation, I will only discuss a bit of the background and the research design. And then since Natalie already discussed the worldwide scenario about the gendered impacts of the pandemic, I will zoom into the Philippines scenario. And then after that, I will proceed to the analysis of the two primary policies on COVID-19 in the Philippines, and then we'll conclude with the recommendation and conclusions of the dissertation. So for the research design, these are the main questions that I addressed in my paper. First, what are the gendered impacts of the pandemic and the responses to address it in the world? Second is the COVID-19 policies in the Philippines gender sensitive? And then next, what are the gendered impacts of the Philippines COVID-19 measures on women in the Philippines? And finally, what is the effect of the gender sensitivity of these policies on the situation of women during the coronavirus crisis? So for the methodology, it's a qualitative research. I conducted desk review and I used gender analysis tools to analyze the policies. And I collected secondary data from materials published by international NGOs. From the academe, I collected data from online news articles, blog posts, and other articles or materials from credible sources. So to give you a background of the Philippines, I'm borrowing the political economic analysis conducted by my colleague, Anna Marie Alhambra. I think she's also here in the webinar. So thank you, Anna, for lending me this slide. So she already performed this for her own dissertation. So Philippines is an archipelagic country in Asia, and the capital is Manila. So that is where most of our central and national government agencies are located in Manila. So if you can see on the map, that's where Manila is. And for the economic structure, it's dominated by wealthy landed families, provincial dynasties, and other families that has risen to power through banking or industry. And because of this, the political structure of the Philippines is oligarchic in character, and this led to the rise of political dynasties due to rent seeking and patronage politics. So for the social structure, Philippines is widely Catholic, and except in some in a region, the southern region, the Muslim Mindanao, wherein peace is just recently sought after years of conflict and negotiations, but it's still a fragile state. They're still in a fragile situation, and with the corona, it's very difficult for them to continue the recovery and rehabilitation. And we're actually proud that the Philippines is one of the most gender equal country because according to that's where the Muslim Mindanao is. So because according to the World Economic Forum, we are not top two in East Asia and the Pacific in terms of gender equality. And I think in terms of global ranking, we are 16th. We are in the 16th place. But sadly, this does not really affect the real situation in the country. So we'll find out more about this later. Okay, so now we zoom into the Philippines to know more about the gendered impacts of the crisis. Um, Health workers actually all over the world, are mainly comprised of women. Globally, I think 70% of the health workforce are women, but in the Philippines, women comprise 90% of the health workers, and now they are more exposed to risks because they do frontline work for the coronavirus response. And there's also an increase in risks in terms of women and children's health because the allocation of resources were diverted to the crisis response. So services were neglected in a lot of ways because of the pandemic. And there's also an increase in violence against women, domestic and intimate partner abuse, cyber violence, online sexual exploitation because victims, due to the lockdown, the victims or the survivors are trapped with their abusers for a longer period of time. And because of the other impacts of the crisis, the economic recession, and all that, they have more things to fight about, which lead to physical violence. And also the responders, the police officers in the Philippines, actually they are more concerned with the implementation of the restrictions about the COVID-19 situation. So, they pay more attention to arresting violators of the lockdown rather than responding to emergency situations like violence, domestic violence and abuses. So in terms of harassment, women also experience harassment at checkpoints because those who do the mandatory checks, they are mostly male police officers. The police force in the Philippines are dominantly male. And yeah, in terms of sex work, because it's illegal in the Philippines, they take advantage of the situation more. So these police and the enforcers, they exploit or they even rape and force prostituted women, to give them a portion of their earnings for safe passage. And even the LGBTs experience discrimination. So there was a viral video on social media wherein two gay individuals were forced to perform lewd acts on Facebook Live because they were accused of violating the the curfew, the lockdown restrictions, but they claimed to be just performing an errand for an old woman in their household. But the village officers punish them by humiliating them on public on social media. And sadly, more OFWs now are in distress and at risk of human trafficking and exploitation because these women, the overseas Filipino workers, the first that are shut down, the industries that they work in are affected by the crisis. So, they're not home, they're in another country, they have no means to earn income, and they are like trapped there because the borders are closed, so they become more vulnerable and yeah, exposed to human trafficking, exploitation, and abuse. Okay, so even the NGOs that reach out to women in need and those who are at risk are also affected in terms of their progress. Their milestones are halted and even backsliding because the lockdown restricts them to contact their recipients and beneficiaries. And it's difficult for the recipients to do the online and the virtual services because they don't have the means, they don't have the gadgets, and they are mostly in far-flung areas. And because there are no public transportation, the welfare organizations cannot continue providing the services needed by their recipients. So they are also suffering the consequences of this crisis. And in the informal sector, they are comprised mostly of women. And the sad thing about it is that they have no social protection. So in terms of economic recession, they are the first to be let go, to be terminated, and they have no safety nets. So it's difficult for them to cope. In conflicted areas like in the Bangsamoro Autonomous region of Muslim Mindanao, women and girls are vulnerable to being recruited by extremist organizations, sexual slavery, trafficking, sexual exploitation, slavery and abuse, and even forced child marriage to help them cope with the economic situation because they are in extreme poverty, especially because of the external shock that we are experiencing now. And another thing, the health workers in the Philippines, who are mostly women, they suffered the travel ban that was recently imposed by the government, by President Duterte, because the government thinks that they are more needed in the country, but they remain to be underpaid and undervalued, overworked. So for them, for these health workers, since they're already exposing their safety, or they're already taking the risk, they might as well get compensated for it properly. So they would rather go out of the country and work in a more developed country, like in the US, in Europe, in Canada, or in other countries that give better compensation and working conditions. Okay. So those are just some of the impacts of COVID-19. And at this moment, I mean, a lot of things are still happening. So of course, it needs to be continuously updated, the data for this paper. But just to show you how I did the analysis of the two primary policies in the Philippines. So I chose this first, the memorandum from the executive secretary on the lockdown or the community quarantine, and the Bayanihan to Heal as One Act, because they are the primary or the mother policy that set the sail for other guidelines or other issuances regarding the COVID-19 crisis in the Philippines. So in analyzing the memorandum, I used the gender scan. And then for the second policy, I used the gender aware appraisal. So just to explain a bit about the gender scan, this tool is actually developed by Professor Natalie Holvoet, our first speaker. So together with her colleague Lisbeth Inberg in 2014, um, they use it to assess the gender sensitivity of the national uh, adaptation programs of action for sub-Saharan African countries. And some of the policy approaches they used are the women in development, or WID, the pre-WID, and the gender and development approaches, and also Moser's policy approaches, which are welfare equity, anti-poverty, efficiency, and empowerment approaches. So for the gender-aware policy appraisal, Natalie already explained earlier about this. This is one of the responsive budgeting initiative by the Commonwealth Secretariat, and it looks into how a policy affects the inequality. So there's already an assumption of inequality in the situation, and the policy is expected to address the situation by allocating budget and properly monitoring the intervention. Okay. So I found out in my analysis that both policies are actually gender blind or gender insensitive. Based on on my analysis, the memorandum on the lockdown, it shows the process in formulating the advisory body, the interagency task force, and all the council or the committee that recommends action for the corona situation. They show no gender balance, low or no participation of women and gender experts. So this is gender blind. So strategic gender needs are not met. And actually, this could have been an ideal policy to address the strategic gender needs in the country. But sadly, because it is gender blind, they weren't able to do so. And for the second policy, the gender aware policy appraisal, shows that the act does not address the practical gender needs of the country, which could have been the case if this were made gender sensitive in the first place, if they integrated the gender perspective in planning or formulating this law. So it failed to recognize the heterogeneity of the communities, the household, and individuals in the country. And another thing, because they used a big amount of public funds, which they diverted from their original allocation to the gender, to responding to the COVID-19 situation. It created a lot of inequalities, and added more vulnerabilities to the already marginalized sector, women and gender sector. So in conclusion, I found in my paper, the findings, realized that external shocks, and this is similar to what Natalie explained in her presentation, the shocks or pandemics like this exacerbate existing inequalities and even add a variety of problems to the situation, to the pandemic situation. So women experience the adverse impacts of the crisis because they are in a more vulnerable position due to their gender roles and already marginalized situation. So they are mostly the poor, the informal workers, unpaid care workers, domestic workers, frontliners, health workers, and so on. So policies in the Philippines are not gender responsive in terms of responding to the COVID-19 situation. So they do not address the gender needs of the affected people or sector. And gender blind policies actually increase gender inequality. So eh, they cause more harm than good to women and men who are already vulnerable in the first place. So as part of my recommendation, it is important to ensure participation of women and gender experts by including them in planning and decision-making bodies, ensuring that there is gender balance and a representative bureau. And of course, resources are very important. So there should be an allocation of resources, enough resources to engender interventions from start to finish and from sector to sector to ensure monitoring and to sustain the good outcome of these interventions. So that's it for my presentation. Thank you for listening. If you have more questions, we're